The early morning sun beat down on her face as the white woman looked disdainfully at the black firefighter standing in his uniform. "What are you doing here?" she scoffed, unaware that he was the one who had saved her life when she was a little girl choking on smoke in a burning house. Amid her arrogance and prejudice, his eyes reflected pain as well as humility. Her words felt the full weight of racism that had accumulated over the years. But what she didn't know was that hidden in his past was a story of courage and sacrifice. This is not just a meeting of two people. It is a collision of two worlds full of hatred and misunderstanding. Audience, this story touches each and every one of us. How do you feel about bias and injustice? Share in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. Your opinions are very important to us and help us promote our channel. You are our support and inspiration, and we appreciate every response. Together, let's break the chains of prejudice and create a world where everyone can be heard. Enjoy the show. As she closes her eyes, memories flood over her. Memories of that terrible night when the world around her turned into chaos and the air was filled with choking smoke. At that time, she was just a child playing in her room when suddenly her world turned upside down. Flames engulfed the house, and the screams of her parents mingled with the crackling of the burning wooden walls. She remembers tripping and falling, her little heart beating in a panicked rhythm. The heat of the fire burned her skin, and the smoke penetrated her lungs, making her gasp. In that moment, everything seemed infinitely terrifying and unbearable. But in the midst of that darkness, when hope of escape was fading, she saw him. A black fireman with a masculine face and confident posture burst into her world. His figure, silhouetted against the raging flames, seemed her only salvation. He approached her and, without a word, seized her by the arm. Her cries for help were heard, and she felt his strength protecting her from the horrors that surrounded her. He pulled her outside, where the cold air hit her face, forcing her to take a full breath. He didn't know that in that moment, he was not only saving her life, but shaping her future. But on that night when he left her safe, he didn't know that his kindness and courage would never be appreciated. It had been many years. Now that she was an adult, it was hard to shake the feeling that he was just another black firefighter just doing his job. Her memories of that night had faded into the shadows, eclipsed by time and new prejudices. She remembered only his skin color, but not his courage, not his selflessness. Soon she will run into him again, unaware that this moment will change both of their lives forever. For him, the encounter will come as a shock, a reminder of how often humanity and prejudice intertwine, leaving behind a trail of pain and misunderstanding. So begins a story full of tragedy, prejudice, and opportunity for redemption. But at this moment, the two characters do not yet know how much they are connected and how fate will force them to meet in this world full of racial barriers and misunderstandings. Her name was Lena, and despite her success in life, she always felt overshadowed. With a fine career and wealth, she was a respected member of her small town, but there was a hidden fear nesting in her, a fear of those who were different from her. That fear had settled in her mind like years of garbage that she never intended to clean up. In the morning, she prepared for a meeting at a local cafe where the women in her social circle gathered. Their conversations about fashion, politics, and personal life often touched on racial issues, which Lena saw through the prism of her own preconceived notions. She didn't realize that these conversations were shaping her views, exacerbating the biases that were so firmly entrenched in her mind. Lena considered herself open-minded, but deep down her thoughts were colored by stereotypes. Today she would be meeting a new acquaintance that a chance encounter had set her up with. He was a black firefighter, and when she'd found that out, her inner voice had told her to avoid him. He can't be like everyone else, her intuition whispered to her, but she brushed those thoughts aside as silly. When they finally met, her heart squeezed and a mask of friendliness appeared on her face. She greeted him, but there was displeasure in her gaze. He seemed alien to her, and the moment she first looked at his face, a resentment flared up in her without her even realizing it. What she saw was not a man, but a member of a group to which she considered all black people to belong. Gradually, their conversation moved from formalities to more personal topics. He talked about his work, about how he had saved people in distress, including those who might never appreciate his labor. Lena listened, but every answer he gave provoked an inner protest in her. Thoughts crept into her mind. Is he really as good as he says he is? And doesn't his skin color affect his professionalism? With every word he said, her distrust grew, and her bias manifested itself in hidden questions. She began to ask provocative questions about his life, expecting to hear something that would confirm her stereotypes. But he answered calmly, with dignity, unaware that his kindness and humanity were causing her even more resistance. When the conversation ended, she left the cafe with a feeling of dissatisfaction. Lena realized that something dark was sitting inside her, and she was scared. She didn't realize that her preconceived notions were not only distorting her perception of this man, but also distancing her from herself, from someone who could understand his story. The next day, when she saw him again on the street, her heart clenched again with fear and hatred. In her mind, this encounter had already become a symbol of everything she didn't understand and didn't want to accept. She did not know that he was the one who had once saved her life, and that this truth would be revealed to her at the most unexpected moment when their destinies would cross again. Black smoke billowed into the air, mingling with the fire that raged around them. For the firefighter, named Mark, it wasn't just a job, it was his calling. He always knew his destiny was to be on the front lines where people needed help. But on that ill-fated evening, when he received a call about an apartment building fire, he didn't know that this particular event would change his life forever. His heart was pounding as he advanced toward the blazing building. His team was rushing to help, but as always, he felt he had to be first. Each step brought him closer to what he knew. There might be someone on the other end of this fiery inferno who needed help. That sense of responsibility and duty overwhelmed him, and he was willing to risk himself to save others. When he entered the house, he was struck by the fury of the flames and the dense smoke that filled everything around him. He knew time was short. Cries for help sounded from behind the wall. Following the sounds, he came upon a closed door. Behind it, something was heard that made his heart clench. A faint child's voice calling for help. Mark kicked open the door and saw her, a little girl, with a face full of tears and eyes full of terror. She was alone, locked in her room, defenseless against the onslaught of fire. The moment he saw her, his instincts kicked in like never before. He rushed toward her, even though the heat and smoke could have snuffed out his own breath. "Hold on tight," he said, leaning toward her so he wouldn't lose a second. She grabbed his hand, and he felt her small fingers clinging to him tightly. Full of fear and hope, he wrapped his arms around her, shielding her body from the fire with his, and together they made their way out of the room. He moved as if he were in a trance, feeling his whole life calm down to this moment. When they got outside, the fire had receded, but the tension in the air had not. Mark handed the girl to the medics and looked around to make sure everyone was safe. He saw her parents rush to her as she cried in their arms, and though he was happy he had saved her, he felt something break inside him. That moment of joy as their lives intertwined was fleeting. Now, years later, he remembered that girl, her frightened face, and how she had looked at him with hope. He didn't know what she had become, didn't know that she had become a prejudiced woman. That memory gnawed at him, reminding him that he might never be recognized for who he really was. Remembering that tragic night, he felt the flames not only burning the walls, but leaving wounds in his soul. He often wondered to himself, did she remember him? Did she ever think about the man who stood on the front lines risking his life? His heartache became a part of his existence, and every time he encountered prejudice, it became even harder. Now that he met her again, he didn't know that the same fear lurked in her heart as in his. Their lives were intertwined, but biases and misunderstandings remained on the path they had yet to travel. Each of them, living their own lives, were still prisoners of their own prejudices and memories that prevented them from truly seeing each other. Lena stood at the window, looking out at the street where cars and people whizzed by. Contradictory emotions flared inside her, a sense of unease and anxiety intertwined with prejudice. The encounter with Mark had left an unpleasant residue in her soul, but instead of addressing her true feelings, she brushed them aside, trying to calm herself. Over and over again, she replayed his words in her head, his smile full of kindness. Is he really that good? She thought, but with each new thought, her inner voice insisted on its stereotypes. Lena was used to seeing the world through a prism in which skin color became the determining factor. There was always an atmosphere of distrust and dislike in her surroundings for those who were different from her. She remembered how, as a child, she had been told about the others, those who were not like them. These preconceived notions were passed from mouth to mouth, taking root in her mind. Lena couldn't help but notice that her own parents, sometimes made unflattering remarks about black people. "They're always so aggressive." She recalled her mother saying the phrase with an expression of contempt. And even though Lena didn't agree with the thought, she still internally internalized that fear. Now when she looked at Mark, her mind automatically went back to his skin color. She couldn't see him as the man who'd gone through hell to save her as a child. Instead, she saw a representative of a group she feared to be in. It was a deeply ingrained stereotype she couldn't overcome. With each new day, her bias only grew stronger. When Lena faced him again, a picture had already emerged in her mind. It wasn't just a man. It was a black firefighter, and his skin color obscured her perception. She didn't notice the compassion in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. Instead, her thoughts were filled with fears that seemed to whisper to her, "Be careful, he could be dangerous." What Lena didn't realize was that this reaction only exacerbated the chasm between them. In her world, skin color was the deciding factor in a relationship. As sad as that was, she knew it was wrong, but her perception was ironclad, and it was incredibly difficult to break out of it. Every time she saw Mark again, her tension increased. She couldn't help but ask herself, "Why is it so hard for me to just see the man?" Lena realized that her bias was not giving her a chance for understanding. Instead of seeing him as someone who had once saved her life, she remained trapped in her fears and stereotypes. Her soul was caught in a struggle between the desire to change her views and the fear that filled her mind. And so, between them, like a wall, stood misunderstanding, a barrier that could not simply be broken down. In this clash of delights, prejudice and fear were the main enemies separating them, and only time would tell if they could find a way to truly understand each other. Mark walked through the streets of his city with his head bowed low, his thoughts preoccupied with what had happened over the past month. He had always tried to be the best in his work, in his life, in his interactions with people, but every now and then, he faced expressions of hatred that left deep scars on his soul. Those hateful words were so loud that they overpowered all other sounds, and their echoes affected his entire existence. It happened one day when he was on duty. A fire truck was stopped at an intersection when a group of teenagers approached them. At first, they were just whistling to get attention, but it soon escalated to insults. "Hey, black man, what? You think you're a hero? Get out of the way! We don't need you!" they shouted, laughing. Like a knife to his heart, every word cut his soul, and he could hardly hold back the tears. These guys didn't understand what he was doing, that he was risking his life for the safety of others. To them, he was just a symbol, a representative of a group they couldn't accept. Unfortunately, such encounters were not uncommon. Mark often heard how some of his fellow black co-workers were also insulted. They were already part of this horrible reality, but that didn't make it any less painful. The society they lived in was becoming more imbued with racial bias every day, and these hateful words were becoming the norm. Every time he heard such words, a spark of anger ignited inside him. Anger not at those who said them, but at the society that allowed it to happen. He wondered how it was possible to live in a world where simple human kindness was seen as something out of the ordinary. Why did his skin color always put him in the position of other? These thoughts haunted him like ghosts, and he often returned to the memory of the tragic night when he had saved the little girl. He wished he could tell her that he was a man, not just the color of his skin. But every taunt, every insult plunged him into more darkness. When he came home, he could not shake off the feeling of hopelessness. Even his family, who had always supported him, couldn't fully understand what he was feeling. He couldn't tell them about what was going on outside their home, the words that were killing him from the inside out. With each new dose of hatred he was subjected to, Mark felt his world shrinking and his hopes for change melting away. He knew that such words affected everyone, his co-workers, the children who were growing up internalizing these prejudices, and the people who might never see him as a real person. Like a dark cloud, hatred overshadowed his life, and he felt he had to find a way to fight it. But how? How can one resist something that seems to have become part of the life of the whole society? Every day when he went outside, he remembered the girl he had saved and that he couldn't let those words consume him. But deep down, Mark knew that fighting hate was a hard road, and every step he took would reflect a fight not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever suffered racial bias. Through the smoke and fire that had once engulfed his life, Mark could still feel the oppressive weight of his childhood traumas. Memories of his childhood reminded him of how early in life he had encountered the cruelty and prejudice that later shaped his path. The echoes of that past continued to echo in his mind, preventing him from finding peace in the present. He grew up in a neighborhood where racial tension was felt at every turn. Although his family was close-knit and his parents tried to protect him from the outside world, the children at school were not so kind. Every day became a challenge. Mark faced taunts and threats that fueled his fears and insecurities. Every joking comment about his skin color left a mark on his heart, forming biases that he was forced to carry into adulthood. One memory resonated particularly painfully in his mind. He remembered how, in third grade, his classmate Dan, whom he had once been friends with, had suddenly become part of the group that bullied him. "You're as black as the night sky and you can't play with us." He left, pointing at the other kids. That moment of betrayal was probably the most devastating for Mark. That day, he realized that the color of his skin made him an outcast. His view of the world changed. Everything now seemed to be divided into our own and others. Since then, every step at school, every trip to the store, every encounter with a stranger had been a struggle. He had to learn to hide his feelings, to mask his fear with a smile and ignore insults. Occasionally he managed to forget about it, but each new insult, each hateful joke, brought him back to those painful memories again and again. These childhood traumas shaped his perceptions and expectations, and over time, biases became his defense mechanism. As he grew up, he found that he perceived those around him through the prism of his wounds. He noticed how those who were different from him caused him distrust. He constantly wondered, what if they laugh at me too? Despite this, there was still a spark of hope in his heart. He always tried to be a better person despite his fears, and didn't let the past completely rule his life. Every time he put on his firefighter's uniform, he strived to be someone who could change perceptions about race and bias. He wanted his actions to speak louder than the words that hurt him as a child. But all those hopes collided with reality. Adulthood had not been kinder. Now, as Mark faced insults and ridicule, he felt those childhood traumas reopen, dealing him painful blows. In his mind, there was a growing struggle between a desire to change the world around him and an inner hatred that he could not completely suppress. Every time he heard someone utter words of hate, it brought him back to the moment when he was that vulnerable child, lost in a world of prejudice. It was as if the echo of his childhood echoed in the present, reminding him that many people, like him, continue to suffer from the effects of the traumas experienced in their youth. One day, sitting in his chair after a long day at work, Mark thought about how he could break this vicious cycle. How can I help others if I suffer from bias myself? He asked himself. Memories of how he had once saved that little girl became a source of inspiration. She was someone who looked to him for hope, and he realized he could still be the one to make a difference in someone's life, even if his own past remained dark. Mark made a decision. He wanted to be a voice for those who couldn't say a word, those who also suffered from prejudice and hatred. Inspired by his childhood experiences, he realized that his past, no matter how painful, should not determine his future. What mattered was not only healing himself, but the opportunity to help others heal their own wounds. With each new day, he took steps towards it, organizing meetings, communicating with the youth, and trying to foster understanding and respect in them. He believed that in time he would be able to break down the walls of hatred that had held him captive for so long, and thereby change the perceptions of those who still remained in the shadow of their prejudices. But he knew that this path would not be easy and full of challenges, and yet he was willing to fight. Mark knew that his job as a firefighter was important, but unfortunately society didn't always share that view. To many, he wasn't just a firefighter, but a representative of all the stereotypes that had been placed on his profession over the years. Like a blanket of prejudice, he covered up the true essence of his job, and with each new day, he felt the weight of it getting heavier and heavier. Stereotypes about firefighters were ingrained in the culture: brave, courageous, always ready to save the world. But Mark knew that this idealization was not always true. Firefighters weren't just fearless heroes in shiny uniforms, but ordinary people with real experiences, with injuries that inflicted insults and misunderstandings on them. They were people who came to the rescue despite their fears and worries, and they did it not for glory, but for people. When challenges came to them, Mark always remembered his own fears. He knew that even when things seemed to be under control, the unpredictable could happen at any moment. Every time he went to a challenge, he was confronted with how others saw him and how that affected his sense of self. "You can't be a firefighter. You're a black man," a passerby once told him when Mark arrived at the scene of a fire he had been called to. Those words cut to the core, making him feel out of place. In the eyes of society, especially among people who have never experienced a real fire, the image of a firefighter has remained idealized. He should be as he is portrayed in the movies, fearless, always in formation, ready for heroic deeds. But Mark knew that reality was far from that picture. He saw his colleagues, people of different races, with different stories and experiences, struggling with prejudice, unable to fully disclose their feelings and experiences. Mark thought of Jake, his partner, who had once been injured on a call and couldn't return to work because of societal prejudice. Many thought he was weak and unable to perform his duties, not realizing that his physical condition didn't reflect his strength as a person. "How can they think I'm not capable? I've saved lives," Jake said, full of frustration. This deeply hurt Mark, making him think about how easily people judge by appearances and are unwilling to see the person behind the stereotype. Every time they went out on a call, Mark knew he had to fight not only the fire, but also his own demons. His perception of what it meant to be a firefighter was skewed. He realized he had to not only protect people from physical threats, but also break down the imaginary boundaries that society had created. Each call was an opportunity to change perceptions, to show that firefighters are not only brave men, but also caring, courageous people who can deal with prejudice. Stereotypes press him, but he knew they had no power over his reality. He decided that his actions and passion for the cause would speak louder than any words of hate. He became active in community initiatives to break stereotypes about firefighters. He spoke at schools, youth meetings, and shared his story about what it means to be a firefighter and the importance of looking beyond appearances. Mark realized that true strength lies in courage, not only physically but also emotionally. He wanted to inspire others to not be afraid to be themselves and to break down the boundaries that separate people from each other. Every day, he tried to fight prejudice, hoping that his story would help change attitudes about the people behind the uniforms and uniforms. Gradually, he began to notice a change. The people they encountered began to look at him differently. It was as if those stereotypes began to crack and crumble, opening up the possibility of real interaction. Mark realized that this job would never end, but he was up for the challenge. Every step he took was a step toward a new reality, where biases had no power and kindness and understanding were the focus. And with each new story he shared, he broke down walls that once seemed insurmountable. There was an autumn silence in the street, interrupted only by the sounds of passing cars and the rustle of fallen leaves. Mark, returning from his call, felt the tension in the air. He didn't know that today would be the day when he would have to face hatred in its most blatant form. As he approached the parking lot, a white woman standing next to a car caught his eye. She was chatting with her friends, and when she saw Mark, she suddenly frowned. Her gaze flashed with malevolence, and Mark felt his heart pounding in his chest. It was as if the shadow of the past was looming over him again, and he knew this would not be a simple meeting. The woman, Emma, was known in her neighborhood for her harsh language and prejudiced views. She often spoke out on local forums, promoting her racist beliefs. A second silence was replaced by her dismissive tone when she finally decided to speak. "How much longer are you going to stand there, black man?" she uttered, her voice full of contempt. "You think wearing that uniform makes you a hero? You can calm down now. You represent nothing but a symbol of ineffectiveness." Every word she said hit Mark like stones thrown in his direction. He stopped, stunned. At that moment, all his hopes for change, all his efforts to break stereotypes and prejudices seemed futile. Before his eyes, she had become the embodiment of all the insults and hatred he had faced throughout his life. Mark took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He knew it would have been easy to react aggressively, but that would only make things worse. Instead, he gathered all his strength and began to speak. "You don't know what I've been through. You don't know how many lives I've saved, and how many times I've risked my life for others, regardless of the color of their skin. I'm here to serve everyone, and it doesn't depend on your opinion." Emma only grinned back. "Serving? You can't even defend yourself. In this town, you're nothing but statistics. You're all like that, lie under the wheels and die if you don't have the courage." Those words pierced him. Anger flared up inside him, and he found it hard to hold back. But in that moment, he thought of the children who could hear this hatred, of the people who had faced similar biases, and of the fact that he wished he could change the world. "Look," he said, "you don't see the person in front of you. I'm not just a black firefighter. I'm a human being. I'm a human being with feelings, with pain, with hope for the best. Every time I go out on a call, I put everything on the line. I see the people I've saved, and I see your hatred poisoning our community." He expected it to work, but Emma only laughed. "You can't talk about love and hope when you are part of the problem yourself. You're only confirming that black people are incapable of anything more. You're better off staying in the shadows." Mark felt the internal conflict building up in him. Every stroke of her words left a mark, and it pained him to see how some people were unwilling to see the world beyond their preconceived notions. He could have walked away by simply ignoring her, but instead he stood his ground, feeling it was his duty to fight this hatred, even if it was difficult. "I will not give up," he said without averting his gaze, "and I will not let your words break me. I will continue to serve and protect and save. And I hope that one day you will realize that everything you speak of is but a reflection of your fear and ignorance." Emma frowned for a moment, her confidence shaken, but then she let out another torrent of hatred. "You're the ones who don't understand. Our culture is being destroyed because of people like you. You're just living in your illusions." With every word she said, Mark realized that neither he nor she could change each other at that moment. He turned and walked away, leaving her behind. His chest clenched with anger, but he knew that he had responded as a man, as a human being, and that it was important to maintain his humanity in this struggle. Mark looked up at the sky full of clouds and felt that despite this hatred, he still had to continue on his way. He knew that his job was not limited to fighting fire. He also fights bias and hatred in a world that sometimes seems completely hopeless. Each time he was confronted with hatred, he grew stronger in his convictions. He was ready to continue this fight, never giving up hope. Though Emma and others like her would continue to speak out, Mark knew that true strength lay in love, understanding, and humanity, and he would do everything he could to bring that message to others. Mark woke up the next morning with a feeling of heaviness on his soul. The confrontation with Emma had left a mark that couldn't be easily erased. His Saturday in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and thinking about how ignorance could lead to a lot of problems, particularly hate and prejudice. He realized that many people, like Emma, acted out of a lack of understanding, and that was not only unfortunate, but dangerous. During the day, when he went back to work, thoughts of past events continued to haunt him. Each meeting with his coworkers reminded him of how important it was to know the truth. Some of them discussed their recent challenges, and conversations about work intertwined with personal stories. Although they were all different in their experiences, each of them felt the need to share their experiences. One day, on break, Mark gathered with his co-workers in the cafeteria. They were exchanging anecdotes about their challenges when one of the girls, Callie, started talking about her childhood. "I grew up in a small town, and we only had one black firefighter," she said. "Everyone thought he was a hero, but at the same time, people would whisper about him behind his back, saying he could never be a good firefighter. I didn't realize why until I moved here and saw how much bias there was." Mark felt Kelly's words resonate with him. He knew that this ignorance is the main reason many people remain captive to their stereotypes. People often don't know the story behind who we are. "I was in their shoes once myself," he said, trying to bring his thoughts to the conversation. "But it's so easy to judge without knowing the truth." Mark continued, "People see skin color and think that's all there is to know. They don't realize that we all carry our stories with us. For example, I've been a firefighter for years, but many of the people who judge me don't know that I saved a man when I was only 12 years old." His story caused surprise among his colleagues. They did not know that Mark had experience in firefighting since childhood. He recounted how the fire engulfed his home that fateful day and how he was ready to save his neighbor, who was trapped at that moment. "I remember how I felt when I saw the fire eating everything in its path. I was scared, but I knew I had to act," he said proudly. His colleagues listened attentively, understanding on their faces. Mark saw sparks of empathy light up in their eyes. "It wasn't easy, and after that I became a fire eater," he added. "But a lot of people still think I'm just a black firefighter, not someone who went through real hell to save people. That ignorance leads to insults and misunderstandings, and there's nothing more tragic than that." Kelly nodded. I agree, and sometimes we don't even realize how easily we can hurt people with our words when we don't know the whole truth. There was silence in the dining room at that moment, and Mark felt that his words were really resonating. Despite this positive wave, Mark still had a question in his heart. How many people like him are out there who will never understand or know the truth about those around them? He knew that his job was not only to serve people, but also to tell his stories and help others realize the importance of understanding and empathy. On the next call that came to them that same day, Mark felt his presence mattered. He was ready to not only fight the fire, but also the preconceived notions that cause people to underestimate those who save lives. He realized that every challenge was an opportunity to not only save people, but to tell them about the real them, shattering stereotypes one action at a time. Meanwhile, Emma may have continued to remain in her delusions, not wanting to know the truth. But as history has shown, ignorance only strengthens hatred, and as long as Mark kept talking and sharing his story, he had hope that even the strongest walls of prejudice could be broken down. Mark stood on the roof of the building where his colleagues had just arrived. There was panic all around. Smoke billowed in the air and the screeching of sirens filled the space. The fire had broken out on the lower floors, and their team was called in to evacuate those remaining inside. But beyond physical rescue, Mark knew he had much more to do today than just put out the fire. He looked around and saw people running through the chaos, their faces contorted with fear. At first, memories of his own fears came over him and what it was like to be trapped when everything around him was ablaze. Suddenly, he remembered how he himself had been a child when the fire engulfed his house, and how it had once cried out for help. From then on, Mark knew that saving a person was more than just physical help. Sometimes it was more than just pulling someone out of a fire. It required understanding the fear and pain that was in every cry for help. As the team began organizing the evacuation, a woman approached him, her face pale with fear. She was pointing to a third-floor window from which screams were coming. My husband, he's in there. Please help him. She was almost sobbing. Mark felt his heart clench. He knew he had to act quickly, but he also realized they had to be careful. Tell me, where was he last? He asked, trying to support her. He was in the bathroom. I don't know how he could have gotten out. Her voice sounded like a humming in his head. Mark looked into her eyes and realized that fear could crush a man more than fire. With the team, he moved quickly toward the building. They set up the ladder and began to climb. But a feeling grew inside him that the rescue would be more than just physical. Mark knew that when they found her husband, he might need more than just physical help. He would need to restore confidence and reassurance, to let her know he wasn't alone. When Mark got to the third floor, he noticed that the bathroom door was locked. The huge roar of fire was coming from behind it, and he began to knock. To her, it's the fire department. Can you hear me? Open the door. We're here to help. Receiving no answer, he felt the tension building. Fear for the man who might be trapped behind the door swelled inside him. With each passing second, the fire grew closer. Finally, he made a decision and, coordinating with his team, kicked the door open. It was dark and hot inside, and he saw a man sitting on the floor with his knees drawn up to his chest. His eyes were full of terror. Mark instantly headed toward him, realizing that the most important thing for this man now was not only physical rescue, but also support. I'm here, he said softly, trying to reassure the man. Everything's going to be all right. I'll save you. Don't worry. The man raised his eyes, and in them Mark saw the fear that pierced him to the core. He knew he needed to help him out of this state. Tell me, what's wrong with you, and how did you end up here? The man began to speak, and in his voice you could hear cries for help, not only physical but emotional. I couldn't get out. I thought it was the end. I didn't even know what to do. Mark slowly walked closer, crouched down next to him, and put his hand on his shoulder. Look, this is really scary, but you're not alone, and we're going to save you. You're a strong man, and together we'll get out of here. He said this knowing that his words could be just as important as physical help. Meanwhile, behind them, the fire continued to grow, and Mark knew that time was short, but he also knew that rescue required humanity as well as speed. He knew he had to restore this man's confidence before they could leave the dangerous place. Now let's get up and walk. I'm holding your hand, and we're going to do this together, he said, and with each word, he realized how important it was to support people in their darkest moments. Gathering his strength, the man rose to his feet, They left the bathroom and headed for the exit. Mark felt his confidence transfer to the man, and it helped him overcome his fear. When they made it outside, the woman below rushed to her husband, hugging him so tightly that Mark saw tears come to her eyes. It was a rescue that went deeper than just getting out of the fire. It was a return to life. And in that moment, he realized how important it was not only to physically save people, but to keep their spirits up and give them hope. Mark knew that every time he pulled someone out of danger, it wasn't just a matter of doing his duty. It was an opportunity to make people feel alive, to help them realize that they were not alone, and that even in the darkest moments, when cries for help echoed from the depths of their souls, there was always hope for rescue. Saving a person is always more than just putting out a fire. It's a moment when you can be a light to someone in the darkness. And Mark knew that every time he stepped up to the challenge, he was ready to be that light. The day Mark saved the man from the fire, he returned home with a sense of accomplishment, but there was still a heaviness in his soul. Saving one man was just a drop in the ocean of prejudice and social norms that continued to grip the hearts and minds of the people around him. He realized that many, like Emma, remained trapped in their preconceived notions of race and who the real heroes were. Sitting at the table with his wife one evening, Mark thought about how much social expectations affect people's perceptions. His thoughts went back to a recent incident when Emma had insulted him on the street. It wasn't just a personal insult, it was a manifestation of a deeper problem where fears, stereotypes, and historical biases were intertwined. "You know," he began, "I keep thinking about how many people can't see beyond the color of a person's skin to the real person. It's not just words, it's whole chains of biases that bind minds. I've seen these biases form from childhood." His wife nodded, knowing what he was talking about. They both worked in emergency services, and talking about racial stereotypes was always relevant. People don't realize that social norms create these chains. They're told from childhood that they should think a certain way, and often those thoughts are formed based on fear and ignorance. She replied, "Yes, that's right." Mark continued, "I can remember being told as a child that black people could be dangerous, but that was just a figment of my imagination. I escaped the prejudice in my heart and in my head. And now, when I see how Emma treats me, I realize that she is simply a product of her environment." As they discussed this issue, they began to recall instances where bias had impacted their work. One time, Mark had rescued a woman from a burning building. She happened to be white, and when he took her outside, her eyes filled with fear, and she immediately started asking who he was. She couldn't even believe that a black firefighter could have saved her. "It was so painful," Mark said, clenching his fists. "I was there, risking my life, and all she could do was look at me with suspicion." Her reaction wasn't just fear, it was the result of all the chains of prejudice that were binding her. People are afraid of what they don't understand, his wife said, lamenting the cruelty of the world. Social norms create barriers, and those barriers prevent them from seeing that race is just one of the traits that make us unique. The next day, Mark went to work again, burdened by these reflections. In every situation he saw, whether at a fire or in everyday life, he realized that people need more than just physical rescue. They need to rethink their preconceived notions, to free themselves from the chains that keep them from understanding the true nature of humanity. A call came in on his shift. When he and his team arrived on the scene, they saw a crowd of people gathered around a burning house. Flames were shooting out, and among the onlookers was the very man Mark had saved that time. He stood there watching the fire, and suddenly their gazes met. The man seemed to be out of breath, and in his eyes was a look of fear that Mark had seen before. "It's going to be okay," he shouted, hoping that his words would reach the heart of the man who had suffered so long from prejudice and fear. But an inner voice told him that those words might not be enough. Salvation could be not only physical, but also emotional. Mark began to approach the man, and as they came face to face, he felt a bond forming between them based on their shared experiences. "I know it's hard, but let's remember that we can be stronger if we support each other. We have to break the chains of bias that hold us back." The people around them began to listen, and in that chaos, they saw that even in the most difficult moments, there was room for understanding and unity. It wasn't just fighting fire with fire. It was an opportunity to start breaking down those old stereotypes and preconceptions that had held them captive. Mark knew that each victory over bias took time and effort, but he believed that together they could overcome these barriers. In this fire, he was not only fighting for his life, but also for the opportunity to change perceptions to build a brighter future for all. Mark Saturday in the office of the fire station, surrounded by the usual noise and bustle, but his mind was silent. His gaze slid over the walls where photos hung, capturing moments of courage and heroism. He was part of this team, but every day he felt more and more that his identity was more than just a firefighter. It was something much more complex than the labels and stereotypes he had to constantly overcome. As he looked at his co-workers, he realized that they all saw him as more than just a man with muscles and a helmet. To them, he was a black firefighter fighting fires. And while he was proud of his work and the fact that he could help people, he wondered inside, what was his true identity in this world, full of prejudice and racial stereotypes? He was reminded of that incident with Emma, how she blasted him with disdain for her words. He knew her behavior had been driven by fear and ignorance, but that didn't ease the pain he felt. She didn't see him as a man who was dedicating his life to helping others, but only undermined his dignity by defining him only by the color of his skin. It made him think about how others perceived him and his work. Numerous thoughts of identity swirled in his head, like a fire seeking to escape the container. What is it like to be a firefighter in a world where bias and fear can overshadow achievement and valor? He knew that many of his colleagues were also victims of stereotypes, and that they had to fight not only fire, but also preconceived notions about themselves. With each challenge, he felt his own identity shrinking under the weight of these expectations. He wondered how he could be who he wanted to be when society continued to define him through the lens of bias. Mark remembered his childhood, how he had to face prejudice when he was still just a boy. People often told him that he couldn't succeed because they only saw his skin color, but it didn't let that stop him. He found the strength to overcome the challenges and prove that black people can not only be equal, but also outstanding in any profession. Yet, with every incident, with every derogatory word spoken by the people around him, he felt those old wounds reopening. He realized that many of the things he had achieved were a credit to his hard work and determination, but unfortunately, they were not always perceived as such. People sometimes looked at him and didn't see a firefighter. They only saw a stereotype imposed by society. In that moment, an idea occurred to him. What if he used his platform to show people that his identity was much broader and deeper than just skin color? What if he could change perceptions about what it means to be a black firefighter? He dreamed of awakening people's desire to see each other for who they are instead of defining them by preconceived notions. With each challenge, with each person saved, he hoped that it could make the world a little better. He decided that he would talk about his story, his experiences, to show that every person deserves to be understood and respected. He would not only fight fire with fire, but also with prejudice, doing his best to show that racial identity should not define who we are. While he was pondering this, one of his co-workers, James, who was also a black firefighter, approached him. "Hey Mark, how are you doing? You look pensive today," he asked, taking a seat next to him. "Yeah, just thinking about what it means to be who I am," Mark replied, about how hard it can be to deal with prejudice. James nodded, understanding his feelings. "You know, we all go through this. Sometimes it feels like we have to fight on two fronts, one with fire and one with bias. But we have to remember that we have the power to change that." Mark pondered his words. He realized that his struggle would not be easy, but now he felt that he was not alone in this. Together with others who shared his experience, they could join forces to make the world a more open and just place. Every day, his desire to share his story and inspire others to understand grew. He realized that his identity was not just the traits that define him, but his actions, his desire for change, and his desire to break the chains of bias that still shackled people in society. With this new determination, he prepared for the challenges that lay ahead and knew that each day could be a new step towards understanding and unity. The day the fire consumed Emma's house, the fates of two people who had never had anything in common before became intertwined in ways they could never have imagined. The fire didn't just engulf the structure. It was the embodiment of fear, rage, and destruction, but it was in its core that hope was born, hope for salvation and second chances. Emma, hurrying to work, smelled smoke in the air. She didn't think much of it at first, but soon the sounds of sirens and people shouting made her stop. Looking around, she saw the crowd gathering around her house. Her heart beat faster as she realized that this was her apartment, where she had spent the last few years creating comfort and security. Across the street, Mark was on call as usual, preparing for what awaited him. He stood next to his team, waiting for the signal to start. But when he saw flames shooting out of the windows and people running out into the street in panic, his instincts kicked in. "Get ready," he shouted, starting to move toward the house. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that saving the people inside would be a difficult and dangerous task. But he couldn't back down. This was his job, his calling. Emma stood in the crowd, her face pale and her eyes full of fear. She saw the firemen, dressed in brightly colored suits, rushing into the building. Her feet felt like they were stuck to the ground, and she couldn't move as her mind reeled with thoughts of her home, her life, her belongings. "Save them," she shouted, pointing to the window where she could see silhouettes of people. In that moment, she didn't realize that there was only one person inside whom she could know. Her world had narrowed down to a simple desire to save herself and those in danger. As Mark and his team made their way through the darkness and smoke, he felt time slowing down. Every step was a risk. Every second could be crucial. Suddenly he heard a cry for help. It was a cry he knew by heart. It was a cry that had once saved him from the memories of his own childhood. He instantly realized that this was not just another life, this was a life to which his destiny was inextricably linked. The power of adrenaline made him act faster. He moved toward the source of the sound with determination, ignoring the fire that was growing closer with each passing moment. All he knew at that moment was that he had an obligation to save a man who might never realize how they were connected. Emma, on the edge of panic, finally realized that her life depended on these men in brightly colored suits. She couldn't just watch them risk their lives to save hers. That moment, when she realized the value of her relationships with those around her, came too late, and that realization became her personal punishment. When Mark finally reached Emma, he saw her crying face, and his heart clenched. This was the same woman who had humiliated him, the one who had spoken words of hate without realizing that a man's life was behind them. In that moment, their fates intertwined in the most critical and tragic context. "Hold on tight," he shouted, pulling her out of the room. Every muscle in his body was working to the limit, but he knew he had no right to give up. Emma, realizing she was being rescued by a black fireman, felt her pride collide with reality. All her prejudice was suddenly nothing compared to her instinct for self-preservation. Running out into the street, they both found themselves in a world where the fire continued to rage and panic raged all around them. Emma walked beside Mark, and she realized that in that moment all her previous preconceptions, her fears and hatreds were losing their power. Fates that had once run parallel were now intertwined, showing how quickly things could change. Mark, looking at her face, saw not just a woman who was humiliating him, but a person in need of help. He felt that with every moment they spent together, they could begin the journey to understanding. As difficult as it was, they were both willing to look each other in the eye and perhaps begin a new journey, a journey where fire serves not only as a symbol of destruction, but also of hope for restoration and reconciliation. So, amid smoke and flames, the fates of these two men, intertwined by fire, became the beginning of a new story, a story of overcoming, understanding, and true humanity, where racial bias and hatred give way to hope and unity. Through the acrid smoke that still lingered in the air, and amid the glowing debris that left only memories of what had been, Mark and Emma stood on the edge of the ruined house. The fiery tongues gradually went out, but their hearts burned with new feelings and realization. The incident had been a turning point for them, changing not only their destinies, but also their understanding of what they represented to each other. Once they had moved a safe distance away, Mark looked back at the building where dreams and hopes had once lived. He realized that the tragedy they had experienced was not just physical destruction, but a reminder of how prejudice and hatred can destroy human bonds. That fire had come to symbolize all the misunderstandings and fears that, like shadows, haunted them both. Emma, feeling the weight of the experience, turned to Mark. There were tears in her eyes, but there was something more behind them, a realization. The realization that their stories were not isolated, but merely a reflection of a broader problem, deeply rooted in society. "I never realized how much words can hurt," she said quietly, looking into his eyes. "And I didn't realize that the one I humiliated was actually the one who could have saved me. Now I see how my preconceived notions were wrong and dangerous." Mark nodded, feeling Emma's understanding punching a hole in the walls of their past. This encounter had made him think about the importance of recognizing his biases and actively confronting them. In that moment, he realized that they not only had the power of forgiveness in their hands, but also the opportunity to create a new dialogue about race relations and identity. "We can't change the past," he said, "but we can use it to make a better future. We need to understand where we came from, so we don't make the same mistakes again. If we don't learn from our mistakes, our society will remain as divided as before." Emma reflected on his words. She understood that in order to move forward, she needed to accept her responsibility for her actions and try to change her behavior and thinking. The emotions that had previously driven her to hate were now turning into a desire to understand and change herself. "I want to change the way I perceive people," she said, her voice shaking. "I realize that behind every face there are stories. I want to learn those stories so that I can never again hurt anyone who doesn't deserve it." Mark, hearing her sincere words, felt a new trust begin to grow between them. It was fragile, but necessary. He also realized that this trust had to be based on mutual respect and understanding. He knew it wouldn't be an easy process, but they were both ready for it. The state of their minds and souls now demanded change, and they both knew that their paths would not be easy. But at this critical moment, when fire destroyed the old life, they found the strength to start a new one. They had to tell their stories to help others realize that only by working together can hatred and prejudice be overcome. That evening, as the fire was put out and the streets began to be cleared of debris, they decided that they should join forces to inspire others. They agreed that from time to time, they needed to share what had happened so that others could learn from their experiences. Understanding the story was the key to creating a future free of hate. "Let's tell our story," Mark suggested. "Let's show people that we are not just faces they see, but people with our own experiences, hopes and dreams." Emma agreed, and this agreement was their first step toward unity. Their hearts burned with a desire to change perceptions, a desire to show that racial bias and hatred could be overcome. By opening their eyes and ears to hear each other, they became a symbol of hope, reminding everyone that understanding the past is the first step to a brighter future. Thus, they began to write a new chapter in their lives, where fire, which once symbolized destruction, now became the embodiment of change and hope. Together, they sought to empower society to see that despite the odds, love and understanding can triumph over hate. Their journey was just beginning, but it was full of faith that they could make the world a better place for future generations. After the flames of the fire were finally extinguished, a new phase in Mark and Emma's lives began, full of hope and change. However, despite their best efforts, the shadows of their traumas continued to haunt them like invisible ghosts that did not want to leave them. For Emma, the fire was not only a symbol of the destruction of her home, but also a revelation of her own prejudices. Although she made a sincere effort to understand Mark and change her attitudes about racial issues, there was still uncertainty in her heart. She often wondered about her reactions to people, especially those who were different from her. At times, when she was with Mark, she found that an inner voice whispered old, prejudiced thoughts that she tried to eradicate. Mark, on the other hand, carried the weight of his history. Every time he faced rejection, he remembered the childhood traumas when his skin color became an object of ridicule. Echoes of those words echoed in his head as he walked the streets, and it felt like people still looked at him with judgment and distrust. Despite the new connections he was making, the old scars on his soul weren't healing as quickly. One day, at a local cafe where they often met, Emma noticed that Mark seemed tense and distant. She decided she had to do something to help him open up about his feelings. She knew that in order to heal, they needed to talk about their fears and how their past was still affecting their current relationship. "Mark," she began, "I feel like sometimes you're not quite there. Maybe we should talk about what we're both going through. I don't want the shadows of our past to get in the way of what we can build together." He sighed and looked at her. She saw the struggle in his eyes. He thought for a moment before answering. "You're right, Emma," he said. "Sometimes I feel like old traumas are still haunting me. It's hard for me to trust people, even you. I remember being humiliated as a child because of the color of my skin. Every time I encounter racism or mistrust, it hurts. I'm afraid it could destroy everything we build." Emma felt a squeeze of compassion in her chest. She realized that each of them was suffering in their own way, and that suffering was affecting their relationship. Feelings of insecurity and fear of pushing each other away created invisible barriers. I don't want you to feel that way around me, she said, trying to convey her feelings. I want to be honest with you, and I want you to know that I'm willing to work on myself to eradicate my preconceived notions. But I also want you to know that I see you as a person, not just a skin color. It was the moment when they both realized that they needed to share their experiences and emotions. Over the next few hours, they began to open up to each other, sharing their stories and memories of the traumas that had shaped their lives. Emma talked about how her own fears and insecurities led to bias. She recognized that her views of the world were based on stereotypes formed by her environment and that she had never considered how this might affect others. Mark, for his part, shared his fears about his past repeating itself. He recalled being excluded from play and social life as a child and how traumatizing it was for him. This pain, fixed in his memory, would sometimes resurface and it would begin to feel the same vulnerability again. They both realized that the past traumas they had experienced were imprinting their perceptions and behaviors in the present. But it was in this discovery that their strength lay. Understanding how the shadows of their trauma affected their relationship was the first step to healing. We can create something new if we work together, Mark said confidently. I want us to help each other heal. I want you to know that I'm not judging you for your old views, because we're all learning. Emma nodded, realizing it would be a difficult journey, but she was ready. Together, they decided that they would set aside time each week to discuss not only their feelings, but also topics related to racial issues and bias. They realized that despite the severity of their past traumas, their bond could be a source of strength and support. Thus, despite the shadows of trauma that haunted them, Mark and Emma began a journey of healing and understanding. Each step they took together became the foundation for a new, deeper relationship built on trust and mutual respect. In the process, they learned to see not only their own shadows, but also the shadows of others, offering a light of hope and understanding for all who have faced similar struggles. With each new day, as Mark and Emma discovered new facets of their relationship, they also began to realize how important it was to discuss racial injustice in their community. These conversations became not just a means for them to understand each other, but an opportunity for them to look more deeply at issues that affected not only their lives, but the lives of many people around them. One evening, sitting on the veranda of their new home, Mark and Emma began a conversation about the racial injustice that still permeates their daily lives. Emma decided it was an important step for them to not only talk about their feelings, but how they could be part of the solution. You know, she began, I'm noticing more and more how many people around us continue to see the world through the lens of prejudice. For example, at the store, when I see security watching black customers, it horrifies me. It's as if their presence in and of itself is suspicious. Mark nodded, feeling the words resonate with his experience. He remembered the many times he had experienced being pulled over for no apparent reason. Those memories were fresh, as if they had happened only a few days ago. It's not just an observation, Emma, he replied. It's a reality. I remember being pulled over once when I was just walking down the street. The officers asked me what I was doing, and even though I had all my papers, I still had to prove that I wasn't a criminal. It's humiliating. Emma felt a pain of guilt rise in her heart. She realized that as a white woman, she had never had to deal with situations like this. In her life, bias had not been so evident. She knew she couldn't fully understand, but she could listen and be an ally. I want you to know that I'm here for you, she said, looking at him earnestly. I can't change what happened, but I want to understand how it's affecting your life, so I can help change the system that allows it to happen. Mark smiled, feeling supported and understood. Hope and a desire to continue this dialogue blossomed in his heart. He realized that change would not happen overnight, but a joint effort could make a big difference. I think we need to talk to others about it, he suggested. If we want things to change, we need to share our stories and show how racial injustice permeates everyday life. Emma agreed. They began discussing how they could initiate conversations about racial justice among their friends and family. They knew it would not be an easy process, but they were willing to talk openly about their feelings and experiences. Maybe we can organize some kind of event, said Emma, full of energy. For example, a discussion night or a workshop where people can share their stories and learn from each other. It would be an opportunity for all of us to see how we can help each other. Mark nodded enthusiastically. He saw how Emma's sincerity and desire to learn could inspire others. They began discussing possible topics, including personal stories about racism, educational materials about the system of oppression, and ways to actively participate in changing societal norms. We can also include a discussion about how each of us can be part of the solution. Mark added, "This is not just the responsibility of Black people, it is a community-wide challenge. We can all contribute to change if we are open and willing to change." These conversations helped them both deepen their knowledge and understanding of racial injustice and how it manifests in people's lives. They realized that one of the most important things they can do is to create a space for safe conversations where people can openly discuss their experiences and the experiences of others. With each step of their discussion, they realized that this was not just a conversation about the past, but a plan for a future in which equality and justice would be core values. They felt that their efforts could be the spark that could ignite the fire of change in the minds of others. Thus, through these discussions, they not only strengthened their relationships, but also opened the door to understanding and agreement that could change the world around them. The shadows of injustice would not disappear instantly, but with each word spoken with intention, they were moving closer to creating a more equal and just society for all. As Mark and Emma continued to deepen their discussions about racial injustice and bias, they realized that it was important not only to talk about personal experiences, but also to examine the history behind these issues. History is not just a collection of dates and events. It is a complex fabric in which people's faiths, hopes, and suffering are intertwined. Each lesson learned from the past can serve as a beacon for future generations, so that they do not repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. One evening, sitting around the table with cups of hot tea, they began to research what historical events and figures had influenced society's perception of race and identity. Emma decided it was worth starting with textbooks and documentaries to give herself more knowledge. "You know, I've never really studied the history of the struggle for human rights," she admitted, looking at Mark with genuine interest. "I've heard of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but I've never really delved into their ideas and how they fought for equality." Mark nodded understandingly. He knew how important it was to discuss these topics, so as not to lose touch with what had happened in the past. "Many people don't realize how deeply rooted racial injustice is," he said. "For example, the history of slavery and segregation left an imprint on our society that is still felt today. Understanding these events will help you see why some of us react the way we do." Emma felt the need to delve deeper into the subject. She asked Mark what stories from his life and the stories of his ancestors could help her understand what was behind his experiences. "My family has been through a lot of hardship," he began, recalling his parents' stories. "My grandfather was one of those forced to leave home to find work during the Great Depression. He faced racial discrimination and was excluded from many opportunities that were available to white people. These events shaped our perception of the world and how we see ourselves in it." Emma listened attentively, realizing how historical events influence personal destinies. She realized that each generation faced the consequences of choices and actions made by previous generations. "What do you think we can do to help change the situation?" she asked. "What can we learn from the events you have experienced?" Mark thought for a moment, realizing how much could be learned from the lessons of history. "I think we should learn from the mistakes of the past," he replied. "Understanding history will help us avoid the same pitfalls. We should emphasize dialogue and education to create a space where people can openly discuss their feelings and stories." Emma nodded, accepting the idea. She understood that change required not only recognizing the problems, but also working to solve them. She suggested organizing a reading group where they could study books and materials about racial justice together, share their thoughts, and discuss how they could apply these lessons to their lives. "We can start with books written by Black authors," she suggested. "This will give us a chance to see the world from a different perspective and realize that racial justice is not just a personal matter, but a community responsibility." Mark smiled, appreciating Emma's initiative. He could see how her desire to learn and grow was opening new horizons for their relationship and for a shared understanding of racial injustice. "It's a great idea," he said. "I think it will help not only us, but others who want to join us." the more people involved in the discussion, the better chance we have of creating change. With these thoughts in mind, they began to gather lists of books and materials they could use in their group. They realized that history lessons are not just subjects to be studied, but an opportunity to create a dialogue about how the past affects the present and the future. A new flame of hope was lit in their hearts. They realized that by studying history, they were not just analyzing facts, but also reconnecting generations, opening the door to a better understanding of each other. Thus, the lessons of history became the foundation for their journey together towards a more just and equitable society, where everyone could see and hear the other, regardless of skin color. One day, as Mark and Emma continued their discussions about racial justice and history lessons, their meetings took a whole new turn. They invited a few friends over to share their thoughts and discuss the ideas they were exploring together. The discussion became lively and rich. But one day, amidst the laughter and sharing, something unexpected entered the room. They were joined in their meeting by Sarah, a longtime friend of Emma's who, like her, was a white woman. Sarah had a sharp mind and an open heart, but she could sometimes be flippant in her views. During a conversation about the importance of understanding racial history, Sarah, without hesitation, uttered a phrase that shocked everyone. "But we're all equal, aren't we? Why should we worry so much about racial bias? I don't see the difference," she said with an innocent smile. There was silence in the room for a moment. Mark, who could feel the tension building, tried to explain, "Actually, Sarah, the issue is not that we are all equal, but that not everyone has had the same opportunities and access to them. The privilege we are talking about is not always visible, but it exists." Sarah, not wanting to get into the conversation, brushed it off and changed the subject. But there was something about the way she did it that puzzled Mark. He felt that she lacked an understanding of what the people in their community were going through. Nevertheless, they continued their discussion, and soon the conversation became more constructive again. Shortly afterward, however, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Emma decided to share a personal story that she had never talked about before. She recalled being in a terrible situation as a child, a fire that occurred in her home. She recalled how she was rescued by firefighters and how she was carried out of the blazing building once when her life was in danger. "I always thought that fire was something terrible," Emma began, her voice shaking with excitement. "But it was actually a turning point in my life. I never found out exactly who it was that saved me. I always thought it was just one of the firemen doing his job." There was silence in the room as everyone listened. Mesmerized by Emma's story, Mark suddenly felt his heart beat faster. He asked himself a question that seemed unthinkable at the time. "Emma," he said cautiously, "when did this happen?" "That was years ago," she said, looking around the room. "I was just a kid, probably about 8 years ago." Mark felt a chill sweep over him, and anxiety filled his whole body. Images of that fire, which he remembered so well because it had been the fireman who had saved her in that fateful moment, came into his mind. "Emma," he said, trying to control his emotions, "it was me. I saved you." Mark's words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Emma stared at him in bewilderment, unable to believe her ears. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How is that possible?" "It was the day I was on duty," Mark continued, trying to remember the details. "I remember walking into a building that was on fire. I saw you crying, and when I found you, you were in the corner of the room. I pulled you outside and handed you to the doctors." Emma was in complete shock. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All these years, she had known that this black firefighter now sitting in front of her was the very man who had saved her life. A storm of feelings arose in her mind, ranging from gratitude to shame for her preconceived notions. "It's incredible," she said, her voice shaking with realization. "I never knew it was you. I couldn't even imagine that the one who saved me could face such insults because of the color of my skin." Mark felt his heart fill with mixed emotions. On the one hand, he was happy that Emma had finally learned the truth about his role in saving her. But on the other hand, he was tormented by the realization of how misunderstandings and prejudice could have changed their relationship forever if this revelation hadn't happened. "Emma," he said, "this is not just my story. This is our story. It's what you need to understand. Underneath the preconceived notions, the insults and stereotypes are real lives. I was there to save you, and now we're both here to learn from each other." The conversation between them began to take on a whole new dynamic. Emma felt her world turn upside down as she realized that her own biases might have prevented her from seeing the man who had once saved her life. This truth was a shocking revelation that opened her eyes to important aspects of their relationship and topics they had talked about before. This meeting of two worlds, two paths that crossed at the most critical moment, showed how deep connections can exist even in the midst of bias and misunderstanding. Emma and Mark realized that their interaction had not just affected them, but could have been a catalyst for change in their environment. Emma took a pause before uttering the words that forever changed the way she thought about racial justice. "I want you to know that I am willing to learn and change. This truth has opened my eyes. I want to do what I can to help others realize that racial bias exists and we must fight it together." From that moment on, their story took on a new meaning. Emma and Mark began a new journey of understanding, cooperation, and mutual support. They knew there was more work to be done, but now they had a common goal to break the chains of prejudice and create a community where everyone could be seen and heard. Since their shocking revelation, Emma and Mark have become close allies in the fight against prejudice and racial injustice. They began organizing meetings to discuss not only their personal experiences, but also the societal stereotypes that prevented a true understanding of human nature. Each time they gathered with friends and acquaintances, they saw the atmosphere change. Mark sensed that a new understanding was emerging among the participants in the meetings. Participants discussed how stereotypes about race and culture are formed from childhood, how they influence the perceptions of others, and how difficult it is to break these preconceived notions. One day at a meeting, Mark decided to give an example that might clarify how much societal stereotypes get in the way of understanding true human nature. "Imagine," he began, "that you see a black man standing on a street corner wearing a hard hat and carrying a crosshair in his hands. What is the first thing that comes to your mind?" Several people in the room, unwittingly agreeing with the bias, began whispering to each other. One of them said, "He's probably a drug addict or a criminal." Mark nodded, realizing this was a common reaction. He continued, "But if you look deeper and found out that this man lost his job and is now struggling to survive, you might have a change of heart. Sometimes we see only what we want to see, ignoring people's real stories and experiences." Emma, sitting next to him, seconded his words. "I was a victim of my own preconceived notions," she admitted. "I didn't realize how stereotypes could cloud my perception until I met Mark and learned his story. We often judge people by their looks and forget that each person carries unique experiences that shape their personality." Mark continued to delve into the topic, explaining how important it is to view people not through the lens of preconceived notions, but as full members of society with their own dreams, fears, and hopes. When we limit our perception of a person to stereotypes, we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to know their true nature. He said, "This leads to misunderstanding and division, rather than unity." A lively discussion emerged among the participants. Some began to reveal their own experiences of how stereotypes affected their interactions with others. One participant shared how her mother always told her to avoid black people, not realizing that her prejudice was formed out of fear and ignorance. "I never considered that it might have been wrong," she admitted, "but now I realize it's just fear based on stereotypes. I want to change and understand others." Mark felt that their conversation had reached the depth he had hoped to see. It wasn't just a conversation about racial bias. It was an exploration of human nature, a discussion of how we can change our perceptions and be more open. "I think," he said, "that we should start with ourselves. Before we judge others, let's ask ourselves, what is behind our fears and biases? Why do we perceive people that way?" This can help us approach every interaction more consciously. The meeting continued, and the participants discussed how they could make changes in their behavior and perceptions. They decided to create a support group that would meet regularly to share stories and experiences to help each other break stereotypes. Emma and Mark realized that their joint efforts were already beginning to bear fruit. People were becoming more open to discussing their biases and to finding the true nature of the people around them. A new sense of hope was ignited in their hearts that they could be catalysts for change in their communities. "It is important to remember," Emma finished, "that each of us has a story to tell. And if we are willing to listen, we can see the world differently. It will not only open our eyes, but it will help us connect on a deeper level. In this realization, they found the strength to continue their efforts. Their meetings became a place where stereotypes were shattered and real human connections were rekindled. In this way, they began to move forward, striving to change not only their own perceptions, but also those of others, inspiring them on the path to understanding and unity. It has been a few months since Emma and Mark first shared their story and became active agents of change in their communities. They have worked tirelessly to use their experiences to create a space where people can share their stories, overcome biases, and seek pathways to true understanding. One day, at another meeting of their support group, Emma said excitedly, "I feel like we have really started to change the minds of the people around us. With every conversation, with every open heart, we are removing layers of bias and hatred, but more importantly, we are creating a place where hope and understanding can be born." Mark, listening to her, felt a surge of confidence. They both knew that there was still a lot of work to be done, but the results of their efforts were already beginning to show. Moreover, some of the group members began to share their own stories of how their perceptions had changed as a result of Emma and Mark's efforts. "At this meeting, I met my neighbor who I had never talked to before," one participant began. "I always thought he was just another nasty black guy, but now that I know his story, I realize how much he has overcome and what his dreams are. He is a human being just like me." Emma and Mark exchanged glances, realizing that their actions had begun to create a chain reaction that was contributing to changes in their environment. Group members began not only sharing their stories, but also actively discussing how they could influence others. Discussions became deeper and richer, and group members felt more connected to each other. Unexpectedly, Emma suggested organizing an open event for the whole community where people could tell their stories, show their talents, and work together to break down prejudices. The event was to be a platform to share experiences and find common values that unite them despite their differences. "We can create a safe space," she suggested enthusiastically, "a place where everyone can share their story and where we can hear each other." Mark enthusiastically endorsed the idea. They began planning an event that encompassed all aspects of their community, from art and music to live discussions and shared experiences. With each new step, they felt more and more that they were moving in the right direction. The day of the event arrived, and it was packed with people from all walks of life. Looking at the diversity of faces in the room, Emma and Mark felt proud that their efforts had led to this opportunity. They invited people to come on stage and share their stories, inspiring everyone in attendance. With each story, the audience heard prejudices and stereotypes dissolved into thin air. People began to realize that all of them, regardless of color or background, face similar challenges and dreams. These stories of hope and overcoming created an atmosphere of unity where all could be heard. As the event came to a close, Emma addressed the audience with a full heart. "We are all different, but within each of us is the power to change our communities for the better. Hope for change starts here and now, when we are willing to listen, learn, and support each other." Mark looked at Emma with pride, knowing that their journey had not ended, but had just begun. This was just the beginning of a new era for their community in Europe based on understanding, respect, and a desire for unity. As the evening ended and people began to disperse, the atmosphere was filled with a sense of hope and a desire for action. Emma and Mark knew that their efforts had already begun to bear fruit, and that their voices were finally being heard. As they left the event, they both felt that together they could accomplish more. With each step they take, they continue to inspire others, creating a world where prejudice and hate give way to love and understanding. Hope for change is becoming a reality, and they were ready to continue this fight together, for themselves and for future generations. Thus, their story is not only an account of the clash of two destinies, but also a testament to how working together can create a world in which each person is valued and understood. In this unity, this hope for change, they found meaning in their journey. Thank you for spending this time with us and learning about this important story. Your opinion is very important to us. Share in the comments what you think about the situation described in this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? How have you dealt with such situations? Each of you is incredibly important to us, and we appreciate your support and participation. Don't forget to subscribe and like our channel so we can continue to share important stories with you. We wish you a good day.